Welcome to part 2 of my series on Miles Mathis's research paper on the Tate Manson murders, where he exposes it as being a staged event by Hollywood and the intelligence agencies. So let's jump right back where we left off in the last video. Before we get to other explosive evidence, let's take a quick look at the trial of Manson. I can't get into the detail here. That would take a book. But everyone who has studied the trial knows it was a sham. The UCLA video archives, you can find footage where Vincent Bugliosi bragged that it was the longest and most expensive trial in history, and that record probably still stands. He also tells us it received more publicity than any other trial in American history, and even when competing with trials like the Scopes Monkey trial and the O.J. Simpson trial, we assume he is correct. As for the publicity, you should ask yourself why the trial was such a media circus. No other trial even comes close as a matter of theatrics. All the major parts seem to have been filled by a casting director seeking the most beautiful, expressive, or otherwise memorable faces and personalities. You should ask yourself what the odds are that all these people in the same trial would be so photogenic. Don't ugly girls in California get arrested for cult murders? No, only the beautiful ones. Some will say, well, Kasabian and Van Houten maybe, but Susan Atkins beautiful? She was a crazy dog. Oh really? That was Atkins at 27. They made her look bad in some old photos, but you can make anyone look bad. You could make Nicole Kidman look bad. You can't make just anyone look that good. I would say she cleaned up pretty well. So again, I ask you, what are the odds of bringing together a random group of runaway kids and majority of them look like movie stars? Some will say, well, this is Hollywood. Hollywood draws gorgeous people. Yes, but these kids weren't auditioning for a movie, at least not in the Standard story, and a lot of them were supposedly picked up in San Francisco. They should be just an average bunch of kids, on the basis of looks. I shouldn't have to remind you, but your average person just isn't that good looking. In an average group of 20 people, you are lucky to find one person this attractive, male or female. That is just the way it is. And we have more. That's Nancy Pittman, Rachel Morse, and Sandra Good. 3 more beauties arrested or profiled as Manson's girls. Nancy Pittman looks like Helen Slater, Supergirl from 1984, and Morse looks like Mariel Hemingway. These girls look less like Charlie's Girls and more like Charlie's Angels. The same could be said on the male side. Bobby Beausoleil looked a lot like Robert Downey Jr. Charles Watson was tall, dark, and handsome. How about Paul Watkins? A very pretty boy in the mold of a Johnny Depp or Davy Jones. Even Barbara Hoyt was attractive in 1969. Take away the granny glasses and she is nearly as pretty as her very pretty friends. That is supposed to be her mugshot. But we have a lot of problems. Why did they scratch out the bottom inch of the photo? Because she is wearing a different blouse in the side photo than the first photo. Look how the collar comes further up her neck in the second photo, and how the blouse is dark beneath the collar. Even without the difference in the blouse and the collar, we can tell the photos weren't taken at the same time. The hair doesn't match. Look at the loose hair on the sides. The first photo, her hair is quite loose around the ears, with many large strands hanging down. In the second photo, her hair is tighter, with only 2 small strands on her visible side. But the biggest difference is in the overall size of her head. Does turning to the side make your head 10% larger? Get out your ruler and your calculator. But it gets stranger. Check out this suppressed photo of the famous 3. Tell me that doesn't look like a scene from a play. What actor's trunk did they pull those dresses from? They don't look like witches, hippies, or anything else. They look like a CIA director's idea of mod young girls. Van Houten looks like she was dressed from the wardrobe of Star Trek. Even the policewoman's wig looks like it came from an actor's trunk. Does that look like a real policewoman's uniform? Look at her waist. Do you think policewomen had coats with cinched waists in the 1960s? Her waist not only looks like it is about 24 inches, the coat is cut to match it. Show me one real policewoman who was ever dressed in a coat like that and I will give you a commendation. That isn't city issue. That is Hollywood issue. But can you tell me why that photo above has been suppressed? More continuity problems. Same day, same dresses, same hallway. That's where they're singing, remember? But before I show you the continuity problem, look at that policewoman. Wow! She's even better looking than Van Houten, who was in the blue-green. Actually, they look almost like sisters, with those long, gorgeous necks. Do you really think they were hiring policewomen right off the set of Bewitched? Is that Serena? Come on. Who would believe this? But the continuity problem is with the badge. This policewoman is wearing her badge on the right breast. The policewoman above with the blonde wig is wearing her badge on the left breast. If you think one of the photos is reversed, you are wrong. You can see the second policewoman in the first picture as well, and we can see the badge on her right breast. This is a major problem because the position of the badge is set by policy. They don't let you just slap the badge on anywhere you like. Police badges are worn above the left chest pocket. Bugliosi admitted that the 6 killers turned out to be so incredibly far out and unusual in their lifestyles and philosophies that when their identities became known, they actually upstaged the victims. Considering that the victims in the Tate house were jet-setting actresses and stylists, this must be seen as fairly incredible. Looking back, we can say with little fear of contradiction that the Manson family actors overplayed their parts by a wide margin, and that the stage direction became more and more fantastical as the play progressed. By the end, all semblance of reality had been left far behind, and only the fact that the television audience in the 60s was still in its infancy, and thereby utterly credulous and naive, can explain the success of the script. Now go to minute 23 of the linked video. Bugliosi is telling the reporter that the Tate murders are the most bizarre, savage, nightmarish murders in the recorded annals of time, and that Linda Kasabian, while testifying, was filled with emotion describing the first night of horror. Unfortunately, we see film of Kasabian walking the hall afterwards in her little house on the prairie dress, and she is smiling and grinning. The cameraman is grinning back at her. Is that the emotion Bugliosi is talking about? Watch Bugliosi too. He is obviously reading from a script. This was before teleprompters, you know. Bugliosi is looking down at a script posted low and in front of him out of the shot. Not only do we get the bizarre, savage, nightmarish murders, we get the horrible, horrendous screams. So poetic. The questions are also planted as well, since Bugliosi doesn't even have to scan down the script to find an answer. The question is also on the script, and the journalists hit their cues like the pros they are. I also send you to minute 121 of the linked video, where Barbara Hoyt is giving testimony to reporters in the hallway outside of the courtroom. Hoyt is not the smartest person in the world, but even she knows better than that. She says, "I don't know if I should," and looks around. Apparently her handlers assure her, and she tells her story about overhearing Adkins. The tape is cut, so some will say she didn't tell anything, but after the cut, the reporter admits that she just told 1 minute's worth of story. We know because he tells Hoyt that there are known to be 5 minutes worth of conversation in Adkins' dialogue, but Hoyt has only told the reporters 1 minute's worth. The reporter wants the full 5 minutes. In the real world, Hoyt's blabbing for a full minute would cause a mistrial, but not here. I'm just surprised they didn't bring the girls into the newsroom and have them give their testimony direct to the public on air. That would have simplified the process considerably. The reporter here is really funny. He says, "We just want you to tell us what happened for the record." For what record? Last time I checked, the record was kept in the courtroom, not out in the hall. We have looked at the fake publicity, now let's look at the cost. This was the most expensive trial in history, but it was only half a trial. There was a prosecution but no defense, so all the cost was on the side of the prosecution. The defense rested without calling a single witness. Manson's lawyers declined to cross-examine most witnesses for the prosecution, and Manson was prevented by the judge from cross-examining them himself, although he had asked to represent himself. Compare that to the O.J. Simpson trial, where most of the cost was on the side of the defense. Simpson hired several of the most expensive defense attorneys in the country, including Alan Dershowitz, F. Lee Bailey, and Robert Shapiro. Simpson spent something like $6 million on his team of 8 lawyers. But Manson wasn't allowed to make any defense, either through his inept lawyers or by his own testimony. Manson's first attorney was Ronald Hughes, and the Manson trial was Hughes's very first time in a courtroom. He had been an attorney for less than a year. Hughes disappeared during the trial and was later found dead, and we can assume that is because he wanted to actually do his job, or because he stumbled upon the evidence I will give you below. Either that, or he was just one more fake death in the script, put there to further demonize the hippies. The mainstream floated the idea that the Manson family got him, but why would the Manson family get Hughes, one of the only people on their side? We know Hughes complained loudly to the judge when Van Houten wasn't allowed to give testimony that Manson had nothing to do with the murders. If Hughes was really killed, the prosecution had much more motive. Although this was the most publicized event in the history of the U.S. legal system, no change of venue outside Los Angeles was granted. No continuance was granted. Despite that, the prosecuting attorney was allowed to enter exhibits into evidence consisting of magazine and newspaper articles, including Life magazine. These articles had titles such as "The Manson Family Murders." Notice that is not the alleged Manson family murders. The judge was allowed exhibits that had already decided the guilt of the accused. There was no real evidence against Manson, and the prosecution even admitted he wasn't at the murder scene and didn't take part in it. He was convicted of masterminding it, not committing it. He was convicted solely on the basis of testimony of his fellow alleged perpetrators, who turned on him under duress from the state. This testimony came from a group of young girls who had done so many drugs they could barely speak. It was admitted that the main witnesses for the prosecution had taken as many as 300 acid trips in their short lives, so their brains were basically fried. The lead witness was Linda Kasabian, who also didn't take part in the actual murders, but was nonetheless charged with 7 counts of murder in order to scare her. She was given immunity for her testimony. Another main witness was Susan Adkins, who was given immunity from the death penalty for testimony against Manson, which she initially gave. However, Adkins sobered up for a moment later on and repudiated all that testimony. Kasabian revealed clear signs of coaching during the trial and was obviously just repeating a story given to her by the state. Then, there is the matter of the 25 unidentified fingerprints at the Tate house. In any real investigation, that would be impossible. Given the length of the investigation and all the people that were questioned, all those who had been at parties at the house in the past couple of years, for instance, it is inconceivable that that many fingerprints would go unassigned. It is unfortunate for the controllers of this story that they let the police admit to all those fingerprints, since they are a clear sign that the scene was not closed to the people we are told were in it. It is a clear sign of the presence of the invisible CIA or FBI crew that was there setting up and filming these fake murders. Some of the Manson family attorneys touch on this point, but of course they don't go where I go. They point out the very high number of fingerprints and the fact that this must leave the matter of perpetrators wide open, especially in the trial of Krenwinkel. But they appear to have never stumbled upon the correct reading of the scene, which would have allowed them to point to the likely owners of those fingerprints. To top it all off, President Nixon declared Manson guilty while the trial was still in session. The jury saw that headline when Manson held up that paper in court. Still, no mistrial. The judge only asked the jurors if they had been influenced by the headline. They said they hadn't been influenced. I guess Jesus Christ could have appeared in court in a burning bush saying Manson was guilty and still no mistrial. Each and every juror could have appeared on the Merv Griffin show and recited testimony, telling Merv how they felt about it. But as long as they swore to the judge that they felt pure afterwards, no mistrial. With that headline in mind, remember what I told you before. The judge allowed magazine articles from Life and other places to be entered as evidence, even though those articles had prejudged Manson and other defendants based on hearsay. So why was this Nixon headline such a big deal? To be consistent, the judge should have taken the newspaper out of Manson's hand and entered it as evidence. To see the other ways the trials of Adkins and Manson were a joke, you may read an article from September 7, 1970, which admits that 2 attorneys from the defense had spent many nights in jail for contempt during the trials, and that a third, Hughes, was so poor that he couldn't afford a suit for the trial. He had to borrow a coat from a reporter. The article admits that the trials, which had been somber at best, were actually filled with laughter. Those in the audience could see what a farce the whole thing was. We see part of this joke when Bugliosi is interviewed at minute 39 of this video. Bugliosi tells us that Manson had been denied his writ of habeas corpus because he was not pro-per or pro-C at the time. What that means is that Manson wasn't allowed to petition the court because he was not representing himself. Bugliosi tells us that Manson's attorney needed to petition the court since Manson had no standing. But that is all false, since anyone can petition a judge for habeas corpus. Every prisoner automatically has standing to file habeas corpus, and it has nothing to do with whether you are representing yourself or whether you have an attorney. In English common law, habeas corpus is known as the Great Writ, and it has the force of a court order. It cannot be overridden or ignored by a judge based on a technicality like pro-per. To see Bugliosi standing there telling us a judge ruled against habeas corpus based on pro-per is beyond corrupt. In any other trial, it would be the most extraordinary sign of corruption one could imagine, but in the Manson trial, it was just one of many. Remember, a person accused of murder is assigned to a public defender if he cannot afford his own attorney. So if a judge could refuse habeas corpus to everyone who already had an attorney, no one could ever file habeas corpus. The state could just say, hey, we already assigned you an attorney, so you aren't pro-C and can't file habeas corpus. You will say, well, in that case, you could just get your attorney to file, couldn't you? Didn't work for Manson, did it? When his personal writ failed, did they then allow his attorney to file for him? Apparently not. You get only one chance, according to the great Bugliosi. Once they get you on a technicality, your attorney is permanently muzzled. At the end of the trial, Manson was allowed to make a statement, but the jury was removed from the courtroom. The reason given was to prevent Manson from implicating his co-defendants, and they cited People vs. Aranda to justify this. But this was nonsense of the first order, since Manson's co-defendants had been implicating him for weeks. His entire conviction was based on testimony by his co-defendants. The trial was a mockery of justice from the first day. Bugliosi was allowed not only to railroad Manson and other defendants, but also to concoct the story for the press. His book, Helter Skelter, has defined the story ever since, although it is nothing but fiction. We may assume he was fed the entire story by the CIA. Amazingly, Bugliosi, in an interview right after the verdict, himself outlined some of the problems in the trial that could lead to appeals. He mentions the incredible pretrial publicity, which anyone can see must have prejudiced all jurors, as it was meant to. He mentions the disappearance of Manson's attorney, Hughes. He mentions Nixon's statement on the front pages, and those are just the tip of the iceberg. But the interesting question in this context is why a chief prosecuting attorney would publicly give tips to the defense in what to appeal. Clearly, those in control of these events wished for them to remain in the papers as long as possible. The prosecution wanted to see appeals as many as possible. This is unprecedented, but it helps explain Nixon's remarks. Remember, the remarks of Nixon were not off the cuff. Nixon was reading from cue cards at the time. It was a prepared statement. No one has ever been able to make sense of that. Why would the president wish to undermine Manson's prosecution and do so in such an extraordinary manner? Nixon was a lawyer himself. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew such a statement showed extraordinary prejudice, that it would be reported in bold headlines, and that it would impact the trial. Why would he do that? Because he knew the outcome was predetermined. There was no chance Manson would ultimately win. But Nixon, like Bugliosi, wished to see as many appeals as possible in order that the story be kept in the papers and on TV as long as possible. As it turns out, the case is still on TV and in the papers 43 years later. The appeals were equally absurd. No trial in history was so monumentally compromised from the first day as were the original Manson trials. Literally thousands of points of appeal were available to the defense, and everyone who followed the trials expected the appellate court to either overturn the convictions or return them to the lower court for a retrial. To confirm the proceedings of the lower court would be to admit on paper that the U.S. legal system was finished. I think even Bugliosi expected that from the appellate court, and he no doubt looked forward to grandstanding for another year. But that isn't what happened. I suppose the government decided it had gotten all the mileage it was going to get out of the story. By that time, 1975 to 1976, Nixon was gone, Hoover was gone, and the Vietnam War was over. The entire appellate decision is at law.justia.com, and I recommend you study it if you have any interest in law. That decision may be even more corrupt than the original decision, since it is a decision not by a jury, but by judges who are supposed to know the law. We expect lawyers to flout logic, and we expect jurors to be ignorant. But seeing such blatant and overt corruption from appellate judges is more disconcerting than either. As long as judges are honest, lawyers and juries can be kept in line. But if judges are corrupt, the whole system is finished. And it is, in fact, finished. This appellate decision reads like the death knell of English jurisprudence. From then on, the courts, like everything else, would be controlled by military intelligence. I will mention only the gravest instance of this corruption. The appellate courts admits that Chief Prosecutor Bugliosi met in private with Manson several times without the consent of Manson's counsel, Kanarek. The appellate courts admits this is a grave violation of Manson's Miranda rights. It admits that it is a violation by Bugliosi of the rules of professional conduct, even citing the relevant clause, Bus in Professor Code 6076. But the appellate court chooses, completely mysteriously and without explanation, to do nothing about either. It neither overturns the conviction, nor sends it back to the lower court, nor brings Bugliosi up for disciplinary action. I mentioned this instance of corruption in the appellate decision over hundreds of others since it is pertinent in another way. As you see, it proves my thesis as well, since it gives Bugliosi the opportunity to discuss the script with Manson. If the entire trial was scripted and controlled, then we would need a way for the two sides to compare notes and make plans. No play is completely self-propelled. The actors need guidance all along the way to prevent mistakes and miscommunication. But during the trial, an actor like Manson might get so isolated by circumstance that he could not keep up the important script updates. This is why he needed private meetings with Bugliosi. Now, let us study Bugliosi's script a bit more closely. Ask yourself this: do 5'3" ex-con bums like Manson have a gift for attracting wayward teen girls? Do they now? Did they in 1969? No. What attracts young girls is money and fame, and Manson had, or should have had, neither. What we discover, if we study recent history, is that wayward teen girls tend to be attracted to various brainwashing programs run, one way or the other, by the government. And it is not so much that the girls are attracted to such programs as it is that they cannot escape them. These programs are like a vortex the young and impressionable cannot swim out of. According to the AP reporter Linda Dutch, who helped to narrate the A&E special called The Manson Girls, Manson's trick was that he recruited very young and very impressionable girls at a time in their lives when they had identity problems and they didn't know where they were going in society. But that is a classic misdirection. That is a good trick, but it wasn't Manson's trick. It was the trick of the military and the intelligence community, which, in the Tate event, was recruiting its own children to act in these manufactured tragedies. Since these kids were their own kids, they were doubly impressionable. They wanted to please their parents. These actors like Sharon Tate and Lynette Fromm and Susan Atkins weren't the most rebellious of their generation. They were actually the least rebellious. These were daddy's little girls, doing their part to keep America safe from commies and anti-war protesters. That's the real Manson family. They looked really dangerous, don't they? About as dangerous as the Brady Bunch. While we are looking at Manson, we should remember that Manson was tied to the victims before the murders. This evidence is usually suppressed, and the standard story is that Manson thought Terry Melcher lived at 10050 Cello Drive. The murders were therefore sold to us as random. However, there was testimony from Lane Wooten to seeing Manson in a red Ferrari with a woman in a scarf in Topanga Canyon in July 1969. Manson was a bum without a job. How could he be driving a Ferrari? Turns out Sharon Tate owned a red Ferrari at the time. The story has been planted that the red Ferrari was the Beach Boys' Dennis Wilson's, but that has never been confirmed. What has been confirmed is that Sharon Tate owned one. It was found in a body shop shortly after the murders, and it was probably Abigail Folger in the car with Manson. Manson and Folger were linked through Esalen as well, since both had been there in the past few months. They were also linked via the Himalayan Foundation, another CIA front, which she gave money to and which he hung around. Folger was also known to have attended fundraisers set up by her mother to aid the Haight-Ashbury Medical Clinic in San Francisco. This was also around the same time many of the Manson family women were being treated there. So she was linked not only to Manson but to the girls. This is most likely where the girls were auditioned and coached for the upcoming Tate movie. This Haight-Ashbury clinic turns out to be a giant red flag, since we find both David Smith and Roger Smith running the place in 1968. David Smith is a high-profile but dark character with CIA pointers all over him. I don't have time to do an expose of him here, but he has links to all sorts of fishy goings-on. We may want to note that he has no date of birth at Wikipedia and no life before 1967, when he founded the clinic. We are led to believe he founded the clinic right out of medical school at age 28. But a now scrubbed bio had him at age 32 when he founded the clinic. It is enough to know that Manson was released from jail on March 21, 1967, and the clinic was founded on June 7, 1967. Manson left Terminal Island Prison in San Pedro, yes, the same San Pedro where the Tate family had been living since 1962, and immediately asked permission to move to San Francisco. He was living in Haight-Ashbury by late April. The summer of 1967 saw both the meteoric rise in LSD availability on the streets as well as the introduction of the never-seen-before STP and PCP. Haight-Ashbury just happened to be the epicenter of both. Why was the formula for STP released by the DOW into the scientific community at large? Why was this lab drug on the streets for cheap? And why was it released in Haight-Ashbury in 1967? The same can be asked of PCP. Why was the animal tranquilizer marketed until then by Park Davis suddenly put on the street for cheap? And why was Haight-Ashbury the first place this was done? If you think the hippies suddenly became lab experts and were brewing these things themselves, you have never hung out with real hippies. Now declassified documents show that there were government drug programs at the time using the youth of Berkeley as human guinea pigs, and that the supply was coming from government and university labs. See the resume of Dr. Wayne O. Evans, for instance. For more recent examples, you can see how crack cocaine was introduced in California in the early 1980s by the CIA, this time targeting blacks and Hispanics. Just search on Gary Webb Dark Alliance. Roger Smith is easier to gloss here, since all you have to know is that he was Manson's parole officer in 1967, before establishing a drug counseling treatment program associated with Haight-Ashbury Clinic in 1968. Coincidence, right? No, not really. In his book, Ed Sanders calls him Roger Smith on one page, then calls him Dr. Roger Smith on the very next page. Parole officers aren't normally doctors of medicine. What did Roger Smith do? Attend 8 years of medical school and do a residency between 1967 and 1968? No, Roger Smith was Manson's handler, not his parole officer. Once Manson was set up in his new role, Roger Smith moved to the Haight-Ashbury operation, which was nothing more than a CIA front. Curiously, Roger Smith also took in Manson's baby Pooh Bear as a foster child when the baby's mother, Mary Bruner, was arrested in Mendocino in June 1968. Handlers do that sort of thing. Parole officers and doctors don't. Notice that I'm not implying that Manson or anyone else was mind-controlled. The drugs in Haight-Ashbury were used mainly as a direct weapon against the minds of the hippies, but not as mind control. All these drugs are tranquilizers and inhibitors and confusers. The Manchurian Candidate theory is more misdirection, at least in this case. I am not denying that MKUltra existed or that it worked on mind control. But in the case of the alleged Tate murders and Kennedy murders, the mind control theories are all on a par with the Satanism theories. They are sucker links planted to misdirect you. If these murders are faked, and if most of the main characters are paid agents, then we don't need anyone to be mind controlled. This is why the government doesn't mind seeing conspiracy theories that include mind control or Satanism. Those theories still include real murderers and real corpses, so the desired story is kept intact. You are allowed and encouraged to theorize along those lines, all you want. with Mae Brussell and others. The only theory you are not allowed to pursue is the correct one. The murders were faked. Obviously, I am not pursuing this theory because I believe the CIA is above murder. I assume that these government agencies are prepared to do whatever they need to do to maintain their hegemony, both foreign and domestic. And although I didn't fully research every murder connected to the Manson events, it is possible some people did die in the making of this movie. I am simply following the evidence I found, which indicates the central Tate murders were faked. I started by realizing that Sharon Tate was never killed, and you will see that evidence very soon. That led me to the realization that the deaths of Sebring, Frykowski, and Folger were also faked. This means that the operation was intended to be a simple con, with no dead bodies. But as usual, it appears to have spun out of control. To maintain the fiction, several other people either had to be killed or, more likely, relocated. This paper will not follow those other people. I will leave them to others to research. But back to Haight-Ashbury. It is unlikely that the Folger family was unaware of the status of the Haight-Ashbury Clinic. Abigail's super-wealthy mother, Inez Folger, was a volunteer under Roger Smith. It was she who helped the clinic receive grants from the Bothan Foundation and the Merrill Trust, the latter of which is found on current lists of CIA fronts. Which means that she was also CIA, or at least a supporter of their anti-hippie events. I found it interesting that Ed Sanders' book, The Family, is often quoted by conspiracy theorists, but even their quotes have been partially scrubbed off the internet. The same two-line quote about Abigail Folger attending a fundraiser for the clinic that I used above can be found in many places, but it is a truncated quote. I read the first edition of The Family, and guess who else was there? Paul and Doris Tate. And who else? The Manson family. We have more indication that Manson was being handled from the start, since George Shibley is the one who visited him right before his release in 1967. Shibley was one of the most high-profile attorneys in California at the time. It would be like Alan Dershowitz visiting some pimp and car thief in a New Jersey state prison and arranging his parole. Why would Shibley meet with Manson pro bono? Manson then missed parole appointments throughout 1967 and 1968, was arrested for marijuana possession in May 1968, and for counterfeited driver's licenses in April 1968, the famous Oxnard bust. He was arrested again on June 4, 1969 for rape. Although any of those things should have landed him back in jail, he always managed to skate. I guess we are supposed to believe that California State Police were impressed by his beard and Jesus bit. In April of 1969, we are told several arrests were made of family members. Van Houten, Rowe, and Watson were all arrested that month, but they too managed to skate. The girls were arrested for grand theft auto and Watson for drugs, but all were returned to the ranch. They were needed for the upcoming highlight reels. But back to the red Ferrari. Even if the car had belonged to Dennis Wilson and not Sharon Tate, we see Manson hanging out with people he had no business hanging out with. If Manson was not a patsy of the CIA or DIA, how was he managing these contacts? He was supposed to be a loser ex-con with no job and no real prospects. Esalen isn't free, and the rich and famous people of LA weren't driving around picking up bums to hang out with. They don't do it now, and they weren't doing it then. It is implied that Manson's entry was drugs or porn, and either of these possibilities does exist. But given what we know now, a third option is far more likely. Manson's entry was via the black agencies that were using him. Sharon Tate's own father was one of these black ops, so we already have a connection right there. Folger was another connection, and she appears to have been used as a liaison with Cash. As we will see, it is no surprise that Tate and Folger and Manson and Atkins and Watson already knew one another. They were all working on the same set. According to Paul Watkins and many other sources, Manson was never short of cash, despite all the girls and babies and cars he had to take care of. He was said to be swimming in money. Where did it come from? Most imply it came from selling drugs or from pimping, but it now appears Manson was bankrolled in a more direct and less compromising way. He was fed money by his handlers. Remember, selling drugs and pimping should have been very dangerous for Manson. He was on parole, he was watched, and he was highly visible. Driving around in a school bus filled with underage girls is not a good way to stay beneath the police radar, especially when many of those girls are from rich families. Angela Lansbury's 15-year-old daughter was one of Manson's girls, we are told, and she traveled with a note saying it was okay. Several other girls were also not runaways. They were simply on loan from Republican or CIA families. Do you think this would have been allowed if Manson were pimping these girls out? No. The only way it would be allowed is if everyone on the inside knew it was a setup. The family was made up of various government agents, so these girls couldn't have been safer if they had been in a nunnery. Even Lansbury is a clue here. If you check her bio at some places like Wikipedia, you find her family goes straight to the top with some interesting connections. Lansbury is British, her grandfather having been the head of the Labour Party in the 1930s. He founded and edited the Daily Herald, which, although allegedly pro-worker, was funded by wealthy businessmen. See my paper on Eugene Debs and my paper on Karl Marx for the modus operandi there. The paper supported the Russian Revolution, which we now know was faked. Angela's father was the wealthy timber merchant Edgar Lansbury, who also pretended to be a leftist, joining the Communist Party. On her mother's side, her grandfather was also very wealthy, being the founder and director of the Grand Opera House in Belfast. Her great-grandmother was a Margaret Graham, which has been scrubbed. However, it is curious to find a Margaret Graham in the peerage who survived the sinking of the Titanic. This is doubly curious in that the Daily Herald reported heavily on the Titanic in its first issues. This Margaret Graham of the Titanic is listed in the British peerage, but it isn't clear why. Although her parents are a Moore and a Campbell, their parents aren't listed and we have no links to nobility. However, the Grahams are high up in the peerage, being the Dukes of Montrose. Angela Lansbury looks quite a lot like the 7th Duke. Angela's brother Bruce was a film and TV producer, ending up vice president at Paramount. Angela and her mother were already in Laurel Canyon by 1942, where we are told Angela soon became part of the underground gay scene in LA. That is admitted at Wikipedia. She and her mother attended lectures by Krishnamurti, where they met Aldous Huxley. This links them to the Theosophy Project. In 1945, Lansbury married Richard Cromwell, now admitted to have been gay. Lansbury holds US, British, and Irish citizenship. One of her cousins is the Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull. Given all that, you may ask yourself how Lansbury's 15-year-old daughter met and began traveling with Manson. It would appear Lansbury had ties to intelligence from way back, like everyone else we will study here. But back to Manson. Although the mainstream story is that he was bedding all of these young women daily, that he was a super violent woman pleaser with a constant erection, and that he impregnated hundreds, the truth is that there were very few pregnancies among the family, and that only one pregnancy can definitely be traced to Manson. This despite the fact we are told that no birth control was allowed. Obviously, these two stories don't add up. The Manson Magical Mystery Tour Bus wasn't a rolling orgy. It was a mobile CIA unit, complete with male and female disguised agents. If you doubt that, remember what color all these hippies decided to paint this yellow school bus. Black. even the windows. Do you honestly think real hippies who are lovers of sunshine and trees and scenery and fresh air are going to paint the windows black? No, that is a trick of the spooks. They always have to travel in black cars with tinted windows. But as I said, these young girls were as safe in there as they would be at George Clooney's house. George Clooney is gay, by the way, that's what he's referencing. Now, back to Manson and Folger. Manson has been placed at the Polanski house well before the alleged murders, even in the standard story. We are told that he was looking for Terry Melcher in March of 1969 during a dinner party. We are told Manson was confronted by photographer Hatami. But since Sebring and Frykowski were both there, why didn't one of them talk to Manson? Frykowski was already as good as moved in, and Sebring was there all the time. Why would Hatimi take it upon himself to talk to a visitor? This looks like a story that has been spun. No doubt, Hatami saw Manson there, but the rest has been rewritten to cover the truth. The standard story also conflicts with itself here. If Manson was told in March that Melcher didn't live there anymore, then he should have known it in August. And yet we're told he didn't know it? It can't be both ways. I would suggest it is neither way. Manson didn't think Melcher lived there in August, and he didn't think Melcher lived there in March. He arrived in March to talk shop about the upcoming movie and wasn't told about the dinner party. So the scriptwriters had to quickly come up with a creative cover story for the benefit of Hatami, if no one else. A red flag no one else appears to have noticed is El Camino College in Torrance. Many of our players spent time there, including Squeaky Fromm, Brian Wilson, Al Jardine, and Frank Zappa. El Camino is known both for its film program and its forensics program. But the biggest clue to the real nature of El Camino is its founding date, 1947. Ring a bell? The first year of the CIA again. We see that year coming up over and over. It now looks like all of San Pedro and most of Torrance and Laurel Canyon were intelligence communities. Many of the houses were CIA houses and were rented to a series of spooks or other people on assignment. Both Terry Melcher and Sharon Tate had intelligence connections, which means the house at 10050 Chilio Drive had been a CIA house from the beginning. It probably had ties to Lookout Mountain for decades. As more indication of that, I remind you that 10050 Chilio Drive was the first house Tate and Polanski looked at. How many young couples with loads of money take the first house they look at? Another person to look at is Charlene Kaffritz, a wealthy bankroller of Manson and his family. Kaffritz was a friend of both Sharon Tate and Terry Melcher, so she is an obvious link between Manson and Tate. And if we didn't already suspect Melcher as a CIA asset, his link to Kaffritz would give us that suspicion immediately. Since Tate's military intelligence connections are known, we may assume Kaffritz also had connections. Actually, any small amount of research shows that Kaffritz's connections to military intelligence are vast. The Kaffritz Foundation is the largest foundation in the DC area. The DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, resides in part in the Kaffritz building. This picture is from the DIA's own website, where we find the caption, "Two clerks at work on aerial film control files in the DIA Kaffritz building, 1960s. That caption intersects this paper in two ways, by giving us a link to Kaffritz and by giving us yet another link to films. That second intersection will soon become apparent. Charlene Kaffritz's maiden name was Lawley, and her mother was Lucille Lawley, who worked for the State Department for 30 years from Roosevelt to Nixon. Among other things, she was executive assistant to Secretary of State Dean Rusk, who was a frequent target of Vietnam anti-war protests. Given that, it is quite easy to see that the common story of Charlene Lawley Kaffritz is more misdirection. Kaffritz was planted in the Tate movie by both the DIA and State Department, and she was simply channeling money to Manson from them. As with the other players in this story, she had to be removed from sight in a rather drastic way by faking her death too. She was found dead in 1970, only 1 year after the Tate murders. Problem is, there is no Social Security death certificate for her and no proof she died. Not only has she been scrubbed from all Cafrit's bios, the Cafrit's bios are scrubbed of their own information. See the Wikipedia bios of Morris and Gwen Cafritz, who were big-time rich people and socialites in DC in the 1960s and 70s. No useful information there. I am not the first researcher who has proposed that Cafritz's death was faked. Before we move on to the next section, it is worth returning for a moment to my mention of Esalen. To follow this important link, I recommend you read Jeffrey Kripal's recent book, some of which is available for free online. It is important that Manson was placed at Esalen in the summer of 1969, since this explains two things. One, it gives us a further connection between Manson and Folger, which I already mentioned. Two, it may give us another source for where the hippies and perhaps the minor Manson girls were getting LSD. Esalen was known as a center of LSD research in the 1960s. In this way, Esalen is also linked to the CIA, which had been interested in LSD for its own purposes since the early 1950s. This is strong indication that the Manson girls were not just taking LSD for recreational reasons, they had been given it as part of their brainwashing. Notice I say brainwashing, not mind control. Even though I will show you that some of the major players here, such as Susan Atkins and Lynette Fromm, were probably actor/agents, and therefore didn't need to be controlled or brainwashed. I assume that many of those in the lesser roles were unaware of the larger plan. It was best these people to be kept in a state of idiocy. In the context of this section of my paper, it becomes clear that LSD was used as another weapon against the hippies. Many young people of the time saw it as a mind-expanding drug. Those supplying the drug to them saw it only as a mind-inhibiting drug. Those who weren't sure of their role in the movie could be convinced to play just about any part with enough hits. And afterwards, they would be so confused they wouldn't know what had happened one way or another. This is probably how to explain someone like Barbara Hoyt. Even so, the major players here weren't real hippies or druggies, they were actors. They weren't brainwashed and they weren't taking LSD. Lynette Fromm won awards in high school for drama, poetry, and dancing. She was popular and well-liked, not at all a problem child. She was known as the Manson family's den mother. Barbara Hoyt described her as maternal and as a very nice, loving person. She grew up in Hollywood, and as a teen she dated Bill Siddons, who went on to manage The Doors. Her father was an aeronautical engineer, which means he probably worked for the military. It is likely he knew Paul Tate, since they both started their careers at the same time in the same place. Lynette was born in 1948, so her father probably started his career around 1947, year one of the CIA. Lynette's link to Bill Siddons is also a big red flag, since Siddons arranged for the funeral of Jim Morrison despite never seeing a body. Remember, Jim Morrison's father was the Rear Admiral in the Navy who was the commander of the U.S. forces at the notorious Gulf of Tonkin false flag, in which the warship USS Maddox radioed that it was under attack when it wasn't. Even the mainstream, including Wikipedia, now admits the incident was faked. It isn't a conspiracy theory. This fake attack was used as justification for Congress passing a resolution giving Johnson the power to wage war upon North Vietnam in 1964 without a full declaration by Congress. The Morrisons weren't above staging an event, that is, and they staged several large ones, including Jim's death. From all this, we can see that Lynette Fromm was an insider, both in the military and in Hollywood. Like Sharon Tate, she grew up as a military asset from the crib. Her later incident with President Ford was another big act, since, if you will remember, her gun had no bullets in the chamber and she didn't cooperate with her own defense. As we will see below with Manson, Adkins, Watson, Van Houten, and the others, her incarceration has been faked from the beginning. Her entire life has been a false flag. If you don't believe that, I encourage you to watch this video of her, well before any arrests were made. Go to minute 36. She and two friends are in various ridiculous costumes, holding guns and reading from cards, practicing their lines. It looks like outtakes from Peter Pan or Bonanza, except that the girls are all showing a lot of leg. Look at that cup. We are on set here, obviously. I also encourage you to notice how clean and scrubbed the girls are. Do these look like hippies or slippies to you? Do these look like girls living in caves and dumpster diving for food? That is how they've been sold to us. I have been around hippies. Their fingernails aren't this clean. Their knees aren't this perfect. They should have scrapes and bruises, especially if they are having sex outside and on the floors and so on. No one who watches this video closely will think it is bad girls getting ready for race wars. These girls aren't even rough enough to play the Ali Sheedy role in The Breakfast Club. All three would have to audition for the Molly Ringwald role. Later parts of the Tate event script would use Lynette Fromm, Sandra Good, and Charles Manson to demonize the environmental movement, just as Manson and his family had demonized the anti-war movement. That is what is really happening whenever you hear any of those people start talking about the trees or the earth, or when they start threatening CEOs. They are good actors to this day because they really do sound like earnest environmentalists. They aren't. They are just acting like environmentalists, so that you will think all environmentalists have the same mentality as Sandra Good or Squeaky Fromm or Charles Manson. They were doing the job in the 70s and 80s that Ted Kaczynski would do in the 90s. You see how one or two high-profile actors can smear an entire movement. This trick is now used over and over in many fields.